So the next part of our lesson is the discussion of how our blood actually clots and prevents us from bleeding either internally or externally. And so a lot of times when we think about blood clotting, we think that that's only with respect to wounds that we have. For example, like if we get a cut externally on our body and it starts to bleed and then it ends up clotting and forming a scab, etc. But remember that there's always damage that happens to your body internally as well, and not just because of trauma, but also because of just everyday activities. So even if you jump off the stairs, a couple of stairs, and you land on the hard floor, that creates enough of an impact to actually damage some of your tissues. And so that process of blood clotting will actually help prevent that internal bleeding as well. So in our little graphic here, you can see our very characteristic platelets. So notice that these look very different from our red blood cells and from our white blood cells. Keep in mind that just like our other blood components, platelets are made in the bone marrow, and however, they are fragments of cells. So they're not considered to be whole cells like red blood cells and white blood cells are. They are considered to be fragments, and they are also incapable of reproducing themselves. So anytime we have to generate more platelets, that also comes from our bone marrow and those stem cells that are in our bone marrow. So you'll notice also that the thrombocytes or the platelets have these kind of little pokey edges here, and that actually has a very specific function other than just making them look kind of cool. So platelets, as we said, are formed from stem cells in the cytoplasm, or from stem cell cytoplasm rather, and they have irregular shapes. And basically these platelets kind of float around through our blood vessels, okay, and through our veins, through our arteries, and just kind of, waiting around for damage to happen. So anytime that we actually have some type of damage, okay, so if you get a cut or you whack your leg or something and you get a bruise, the platelets are going to catch on the broken vessel walls. So if the capillaries get damaged, for example, those little pokey edges around the platelets actually allow them to catch and snag onto the wound or onto the damaged vessel wall. And then eventually what happens is those platelets break open, and that initiates a very complex, what we call cascade of processes that are involved in clotting. So when we look at the next slide here, one of the things on this graphic that you can see there's this are characteristic, of course, red blood cells, those nice biconcave discs. But then you'll also notice there's also this kind of almost looking like a web, a spider's web, or like a net catching those red blood cells. And that actually is part of the clotting process that prevents bleeding. So platelets are membrane-bound cytoplasmic fragments that break off from unusually large cells found in the bone marrow. So again, they are fragments of cells that break off from bigger cells and end up with those very jaggedy edges that are important for catching on wounds. They are 2 to 3 microns in diameter. They do not have nuclei, so they're similar to red blood cells in that way. So they are incapable of reproducing themselves. But of course, they play that essential role in clotting and plugging breaks in blood vessels. And clotting maintains homeostasis by preventing massive blood loss, either internally or externally. And the proper name actually for homeostasis of blood is, believe it or not, probably not a surprise, hemostasis, okay? So that maintenance of appropriate blood volume and red blood cells, etc., is known as hemostasis. And blood clotting occurs in a series of actually very, very complex steps. So if we take a look at our next slide here, we're going to look at this again. Repeat, and there we go. So when we look at the clotting process, this slide is actually just the very kind of surface of the clotting process. We'll watch a video in class that shows us this in a lot more detail, but this slide presents the basics. So remember when the platelets catch on a wound, so they have those little pokey edges, they catch on a wound, and what that catching on the wound of the vessel does is it actually causes the platelet to burst open, and it releases chemical compounds that combine with other blood components to form an initial protein called thromboplastin. Okay, so it's not like the clotting process happens like immediately as soon as the thrombocytes, hook on a wound, it actually is we call it a cascade, but it actually is a very complex series of chemical reactions. So the first thing, however, is a protein called thromboplastin is formed, and then thromboplastin combines with calcium ions to activate another blood protein called prothrombin. And you'll notice that you have the thromboplastin and the prothrombin, of course, coming from the thrombocytes, right, which is the name for the platelets. And the other thing is that you'll notice that we have calcium ions involved here. So of course we always associate calcium ions and calcium with healthy bones and healthy teeth, but also very, very important in terms of the clotting function. Prothrombin is then converted to an enzyme known as thrombin, which actually splits up a fibrinogen molecule, and then the fibrinogen is converted into these fibrous threads which wrap and seal the wound, catching all of those red blood cells. So on the previous slide, when we saw that kind of spider webby kind of looking material that was kind of catching those red blood cells, that's the fibrinogen. Okay, so and if indeed you did look at a scab under a microscope, kind of yucky, but if you did, you would be able to see they're almost like threads, okay, that actually work to seal the wound. So if we take a look at just our general graphic here, we have a normal blood vessel. So again, as I said, if you get a cut or you bump your shin or something and you get damage to a blood vessel, you'll notice that we have the red blood cells coming out of that wound. And that would be like, when you get a bruise, basically the blood has seeped out and is kind of under the surface of the skin. And so when someone has their clotting is working properly, okay, so there's no issues with blood clotting, the initial thing that'll happen is the platelets will snag on that wound, just like we said, and as they snag on that wound, so down here, they will break open and initiate that very complex cascade of chemical reactions, the end result being the fibrin, which will, and you can see the little thread-like material there, the fibrin, which will eventually capture those red blood cells and seal off the wound. So the video here on the blood clotting cascade shows us how complex this process actually is. So there's multiple clotting factors that work almost like a series of dominoes. So once one of the factors is initiated, it basically tips off the other one to start working as well until we get to this very end part where the fibrin is actually produced to seal the wound. So in our final little slide here, this is just kind of a overall taking a look at the difference between the different cell types that we've talked about in terms of where they're made, in terms of their quantity in our blood volume, in terms of their size in comparison to one another, their function, their lifespan, and then of course their general appearance. So just a few reminders here that your white blood cells are going to be your largest, okay, of your formed blood components. Your red blood cells are the second largest, and then your platelets, of course, are going to be the smallest of the three. And so that piece is kind of important. It's not specifically in the program of studies, but being able to read that information in a table and understand that, okay, this is, the smallest unit. So, 2 microns, so that should be the platelets. And then we have like this other thing that's like 25 microns. So that's probably, a white blood cell because it's a lot bigger, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And of course, as always, what's important is the function of the different types of the formed portions of the blood. So red blood cells, of course, to carry oxygen to the tissues and carry away carbon dioxide. The white blood cells, regardless of type, are to help us fight disease. And just keep in mind, though, that the monocytes are the ones that engulf foreign particles. So that would be like our macrophages, right? The phagocytosis piece, they engulf and destroy. And that's non-specific, meaning that our macrophages can engulf and destroy all kinds of different pathogens, okay? On the other hand, our lymphocytes, remember these are our B and our T cells, right? So our B and our T cells, these are, remember, what we would call our specific defense because they make antibodies that are specific to individual pathogens, okay? So remember, each antibody is unique to each pathogen. And so that's the difference, of course, between those monocytes and the lymphocytes, okay? The monocytes are non-specific. They can go after a whole bunch of different pathogens. The lymphocytes, however, are involved in very specific immune system response by producing antibodies. And then, of course, lastly, as we just discussed, our platelets are involved in homeostasis, specifically hemostasis, by allowing us to seal seal wounds and prevent internal and external blood loss.